The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as tourists began gathering for the changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood James Mitchell, a middle-aged accountant from Ohio who had saved for 3 years to bring his family to London. This was their dream vacation, and James carried his life savings in cash, converted to British pounds, tucked safely in his worn leather wallet. The crowd pressed closer to the palace gates as the iconic red-uniformed guards took their positions. James found himself mesmerized by their perfect stillness, their unwavering focus despite the chaos of camera flashes and excited chatter around them. One guard in particular caught his attention, a tall, broad-shouldered young man whose steely blue eyes seemed to look right through the gathering crowd. What James didn't know was that this guard, Private Thomas Hartford, had been standing at this very post for over 2 hours already. Thomas had joined the Queen's Guard just 8 months ago, following a family tradition that stretched back 3 generations. His grandfather had served during World War II, his father during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and now Thomas carried on the family legacy of unwavering service. The training had been brutal, months of learning to stand perfectly still for hours, ignoring pain, discomfort, and every possible distraction. Thomas had learned to control his breathing, his blinking, even his heartbeat seemed to slow when he was on duty. The tourists saw only the surface, the perfect uniform, the gleaming buttons, the motionless stance. They had no idea of the mental discipline required to maintain such composure. As the crowd grew larger, James felt the familiar weight of his wallet pressing against his chest pocket. Inside was everything, $5,000 worth of British pounds that represented their entire vacation budget. Money for hotels, meals, souvenirs, and the special dinner he had planned for his wife's birthday tomorrow. The wallet was old, a gift from his father 20 years ago, and the leather had begun to crack along the edges. The excitement of the moment overwhelmed James as he pulled out his phone to capture the perfect shot of the stoic guard. He wanted to get closer, to frame the guard against the magnificent backdrop of the palace. Other tourists were doing the same, pushing forward with their cameras and phones, creating a sea of arms reaching toward the guards. In his eagerness to get the perfect angle, James leaned forward over the barrier rope. The movement caused his jacket to shift, and the worn leather wallet, weakened by years of use and stuffed full of cash, finally gave way. The old stitching split, and before James could react, a cascade of 20 and 50-pound notes began floating down like colorful leaves in the morning breeze. The crowd gasped collectively as they watched hundreds of pounds fluttered through the air. Some bills landed at the base of the palace gates, others scattered across the cobblestones, and several came to rest directly at the polished black boots of Private Thomas Hartford. The wind caught more of the money, sending it dancing across the courtyard in a scene that seemed almost surreal. James stood frozen in horror, watching his family's vacation budget literally blowing away. His wife Sarah grabbed his arm, her face pale with shock. Their 2 children, Emma and Michael, stared wide-eyed as strangers began pointing and murmuring. Some tourists started reaching for the scattered money, while others pulled out their phones to record the unfolding drama. The security situation became tense immediately. Palace security guards began moving through the crowd, unsure whether this was an accident or some kind of distraction for a larger scheme. Their training had prepared them for many scenarios, but a tourist's wallet exploding in a shower of cash was not one of them. The crowd's behavior became unpredictable as some people began grabbing at the money while others stood back, unsure what to do. Through it all, Private Thomas Hartford remained absolutely motionless. Several 50-pound notes had landed directly on his boots, more were scattered around his feet, and one bill had even caught on his bayonet. According to his training, he was not to move, not to react, not to break character under any circumstances. The guard manual was clear: maintain position regardless of distractions. But Thomas was human, and inside that perfect military exterior, his mind was racing. He could see the tourist's face, the genuine distress and embarrassment. He could see the man's wife trying to comfort him, the children looking confused and scared. He could also see other people in the crowd beginning to pocket the scattered money, taking advantage of the chaos. The moments stretched on, feeling like hours, though it was only seconds. James finally broke from his paralysis and began desperately trying to collect his money. Dropping to his knees on the cobblestones, the security guards were approaching, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. The other tourists continued to watch and record, some helping, others simply observing the spectacle. And still, Private Thomas Hartford stood like a statue, the cash at his feet seeming to mock the very discipline he had spent months perfecting. The morning sun climbed higher, the crowd grew larger, and everyone waited to see what would happen next. This was not just about money anymore. It had become a test of human compassion against military duty, with hundreds of eyes watching every second. The story of what happened next would spread far beyond the palace gates, shared on social media, discussed in newspapers, and remembered as one of those rare moments when humanity and protocol collided in the most public way possible. But in that suspended moment, with the money scattered at his feet and a desperate family looking on, Private Thomas Hartford faced a choice that would define not just his military career, but his character as a human being. The weight of tradition pressed down on his shoulders as heavily as his ceremonial uniform. While the simple human need to help battled against years of disciplined training, the crowd held its breath, the cameras continued rolling, and the scattered money fluttered gently in the morning breeze, waiting for history to unfold. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as James Mitchell scrambled on his hands and knees, desperately trying to collect his scattered life savings. His face burned with embarrassment as dozens of tourists watched his humiliation unfold. Some kind strangers began helping him gather the bills, but others seemed frozen by the unusual situation, unsure if they should intervene or simply observe. Private Thomas Hartford's mind was racing behind his perfectly composed exterior. In his 8 months of service he had faced crying children, aggressive tourists, sudden loud noises, and even a drunk man who had tried to climb the palace gates. Through it all, he had maintained his position without so much as a twitch. His commanding officer, Sergeant Major Williams, had praised him for his exceptional discipline and unwavering focus. But this was different. This wasn't someone trying to get a reaction for entertainment or social media fame. This was a genuine accident, a family's vacation fund scattered to the wind through no fault of their own. Thomas could see the genuine panic in the man's eyes, who could hear his wife's quiet sobs as she tried to help collect the money while keeping their children close. The palace security team was now fully engaged, with 3 uniformed officers moving through the crowd. Their primary concern was crowd control and ensuring this wasn't some elaborate distraction for a security breach. Lead Security Officer David Chen had been working at the palace for 12 years and had seen everything from marriage proposals gone wrong to protesters chaining themselves to the gates. Chen approached James carefully, speaking in calm, professional tones. "Sir, I need you to please step back from the restricted area. We'll help you collect your belongings, but I need you to move away from the guard position immediately." His voice carried authority but also understanding. He could see this was an accident, not a deliberate disruption. Sarah Mitchell was fighting back tears as she watched their carefully planned vacation crumbling before her eyes. They had saved every penny for this trip, skipping dinners out, avoiding movie theaters, even growing their own vegetables to cut grocery costs. The money scattered across the cobblestones represented months of sacrifice and careful planning. She looked at her husband's face and saw the same devastation she felt in her own heart. Their daughter Emma, only 8 years old, tugged on her mother's jacket. "Mummy, why won't the soldier help Daddy pick up the money?" The innocent question pierced through Sarah's composure. How do you explain military protocol to a child when it seems so heartless in the face of obvious need? Meanwhile, the crowd's behavior was becoming increasingly problematic. While most tourists were respectful, a few opportunistic individuals had begun pocketing some of the scattered bills. One teenage boy had already stuffed several 20-pound notes into his jacket, thinking no one had noticed. An elderly woman had discreetly picked up a 50-pound note and was quickly moving away from the scene. Thomas saw it all. His peripheral vision, trained to catch the slightest movement or potential threat, caught every theft, every act of kindness, and every moment of James's growing desperation. The bills at his feet seemed to mock him. 3 50-pound notes lay directly on his polished boots, and several 20s were scattered within arm's reach. He could help. He could break protocol just this once, just for a moment, to help a family in genuine distress, but the consequences would be severe. Breaking position while on ceremonial duty was a court-martial offense. He could lose his rank, his career, his family's proud military tradition. His father had warned him about moments like this, when human compassion would battle against military discipline. "The uniform comes first, son," his father had said. "Personal feelings cannot interfere with duty." The situation grew more tense as Sergeant Major Williams appeared from the guardhouse. Having been alerted to the disturbance, Williams was a 30-year veteran whose reputation for strict discipline was legendary throughout the regiment. He had never, in 3 decades of service, seen a guard break position for any reason. His steely gray eyes surveyed the scene, taking in every detail with military precision. Williams immediately assessed the crowd control situation, the scattered money, and the positioning of his guard. He could see that Private Hartford was maintaining perfect discipline despite the unusual circumstances. This was exactly the kind of test that separated truly exceptional guards from the merely competent ones. James had managed to collect about half of his scattered money, but the bills were spread over a wide area. Some had blown under barriers, others had been trampled by the crowd, and several were clearly visible at the guard's feet. His hands shook as he counted what he had recovered. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough for the vacation they had planned. The media attention was growing as well. Several tourists were live streaming the event on their phones, and a local news crew that had been covering a different story at the palace had noticed the commotion. The story was already spreading on social media with hashtags like #Buckingham Palace Incident and #Royal Guard Test. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat in his ears despite his training to remain calm. Every instinct told him to help, to break protocol just this once for a family clearly in need. But breaking would mean more than just helping one person. It would mean abandoning everything he had worked for, everything his family had represented for generations. The crowd began to thin slightly as some tourists moved on to other attractions, but a core group remained, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The tension was palpable. Even the other guards at nearby positions seemed to sense the unusual situation, though they too remained perfectly still. Security Officer Chen had finished his assessment and was now helping James systematically search for the remaining money. But both men knew that several bills were clearly visible at the guard's feet, and according to protocol, those bills were now in a restricted area that civilians could not enter. Sarah Mitchell looked directly at Thomas, her eyes pleading without words. She didn't know his name, didn't know anything about him except that he was a young man in an impossible situation. But in that moment, she saw past the uniform to the person underneath, and she hoped that person might find a way to help her family. The morning sun continued to climb, casting different shadows across the courtyard as the standoff continued. James had recovered what money he could from the accessible areas, but significant amounts remained scattered around the guard's position. The family's vacation hung in the balance. Thomas's military career teetered on the edge of a decision, and hundreds of onlookers waited to see what would happen when duty and compassion collided in the most public way possible. Sergeant Major Williams stepped closer, his own mind calculating the implications of every possible outcome. This was about to become either a textbook example of military discipline or a career-ending breach of protocol, and the whole world was watching through the lenses of countless phones and cameras. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the usual sounds of London traffic seemed muted as everyone waited for what would happen next. Private Thomas Hartford stood motionless, but inside his mind, a war was raging between everything he had been taught and everything he felt was right. Sergeant Major Williams moved closer, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of the situation. He had seen guards tested before, but never quite like this. The scattered money at Hartford's feet presented a unique challenge, one that wasn't covered in any training manual. Williams knew that whatever happened in the next few minutes would either reinforce the legendary discipline of the Queen's Guard or create a precedent that could change everything. James Mitchell had given up, trying to collect the money near the guard's position. Security protocols prevented him from getting close enough, and he could see that several significant bills were clearly visible on and around the guard's boots. His shoulders sagged with defeat as he realized that nearly a third of their vacation money was effectively lost, sitting just feet away but completely unreachable. Sarah watched her husband's face crumble and felt her own heart breaking. This was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime, their reward for years of saving and sacrifice. She thought about the small restaurant back home where she worked double shifts to help save for this vacation, about the nights they had stayed home instead of going out, about all the small sacrifices that had led to this moment. Their son Michael, 10 years old, and fascinated by military history, stepped forward despite his mother's restraining hand. "Excuse me, Mr. Soldier," he said in his clear, young voice that carried across the courtyard. "My dad dropped his money by accident. Can you help us pick it up?" The crowd collectively held its breath. The innocence of a child's request cut through all the complexity of military protocol and human emotion. Thomas heard every word clearly, and for just a moment, his perfectly controlled breathing hitched almost imperceptibly. Williams felt the weight of the moment too. In 30 years of service, he had never faced a situation quite like this. The boy's simple request exposed the fundamental tension between rigid military discipline and basic human decency. He knew that the cameras were rolling, that this moment would likely be replayed thousands of times on social media, that it would become part of Royal Guard legend one way or another. The crowd had grown again as word spread about the unusual standoff. Hotel concierges were directing guests to come see the situation at the palace, and several news outlets were now sending reporters to cover what was being called the Royal Guard's dilemma on social media. Among the onlookers was Margaret Thornbury, an 82-year-old retired teacher who had lived in London her entire life. She had watched the changing of the guard ceremony hundreds of times over the decades and had deep respect for the tradition and discipline it represented. But she also saw a family in genuine distress and a young man caught between duty and compassion. Margaret made her way through the crowd, her walking stick tapping against the cobblestones. She approached Security Officer Chen, who was still coordinating the situation. "Young man," she said in the crisp accent of a longtime Londoner, "I've been watching this ceremony for 70 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this." Chen nodded respectfully. "Yes, ma'am. It's certainly an unusual situation. That poor family," Margaret continued, looking toward the Mitchells, "and that young guard, torn between his duty and his conscience. There must be something we can do." Meanwhile, the other guards at nearby positions were acutely aware of the situation unfolding near their colleague. They couldn't turn to look, couldn't break their own positions, but they could sense the tension in the air. Each of them was silently grateful that they weren't the one facing this impossible choice. Private Hartford's training had taught him to compartmentalize, to separate his personal feelings from his professional duties. But the child's simple question had broken through his mental barriers. He found himself thinking about his own younger brother, about how he would feel if his family were in a similar situation in a foreign country. The live streams and videos were already going viral. Hashtag Royal Guard Dilemma was trending on Twitter, with thousands of people debating whether the guard should break protocol to help the family. The comments ranged from military discipline above all to show some basic human kindness to this is what's wrong with society today. James had counted his recovered money 3 times, hoping somehow the total would change. They had lost approximately £1,500, not everything, but enough to seriously impact their planned activities. The special birthday dinner he had planned for Sarah would have to be cancelled. The West End show tickets they had dreamed about were no longer affordable. The trip to Edinburgh they had planned for later in the week was impossible now. Sarah noticed her husband's calculations and felt a new wave of sadness wash over her. But she also felt something else, a growing admiration for the young guard who stood so perfectly still despite the moral weight of the situation. She could see in his eyes that he was struggling, that this wasn't easy for him either. The palace's head of public relations, Catherine Moore, who had been alerted to the situation and was now monitoring the social media coverage. The story was spreading internationally, with news outlets from the Mitchell family's home state of Ohio picking up the story. The palace's reputation for maintaining protocol was being tested in the most public way possible. Moore quickly conferred with Williams about the potential ramifications. Breaking protocol would send one message about the guards' humanity, but could also be seen as undermining the very discipline and reliability that made them symbols of British tradition. Maintaining protocol would preserve tradition but might appear heartless to a global audience. Watching a family's distress, Thomas could hear conversations around him, could sense the growing media attention, could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him. But most of all, he could hear the quiet sniveling of the little boy who had asked for his help. I could see the defeat in his father's posture, could feel the mounting pressure of a decision that would define not just this moment, but possibly his entire military career. A new voice cut through the crowd, that of Colonel James Pemberton, the regiment's commanding officer, who had been summoned when the situation escalated. Pemberton was known throughout the military for his fair but strict leadership. He had served in active combat zones, had made life-and-death decisions under fire. But this situation presented a different kind of challenge entirely. As Pemberton approached, Williams snapped to attention, and the crowd sensed that someone of higher authority had arrived. The colonel surveyed the scene with the calm assessment of a career military officer, taking in the scattered money, the distressed family, the perfectly positioned guard, and the hundreds of onlookers with their cameras ready to capture whatever happened next. The moment of truth was approaching. Everyone could feel it. The decision that had been building for what felt like hours was about to be made, and it would ripple far beyond this single morning at Buckingham Palace. Thomas Hartford stood at the center of it all, a young man whose next action would either uphold centuries of military tradition or redefine what it meant to serve with honor in the modern world. Colonel James Pemberton stood for a long moment, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts as he assessed the unprecedented situation. At 55, he had commanded respect in battlefields across Afghanistan and Iraq, and had made decisions that affected hundreds of lives. But never had he faced a moment where military protocol and basic human decency seemed so directly at odds in such a public forum. The silence stretched as Pemberton's eyes moved from the scattered money to the distressed family, then to his perfectly disciplined guard, and finally to the hundreds of cameras recording every second. He could feel the weight of tradition pressing down on him, the expectations of centuries of military protocol, but he could also see the genuine human suffering playing out before him. Private Thomas Hartford remained absolutely motionless, but sweat had begun to bead on his forehead despite the cool morning air. He could sense his commanding officer's presence, could feel the additional weight of authority that had just arrived at the scene. His military training told him to await orders, to maintain position until specifically instructed otherwise, but his conscience was screaming at him to help the family whose distress was so palpable. James Mitchell had stopped trying to collect money and now stood with his arm around his wife, both parents trying to comfort their children who were beginning to understand that something had gone terribly wrong with their vocation. Emma kept asking why the nice soldier wouldn't help them, and Michael was trying to explain military rules he didn't fully understand himself. Margaret Thornberry, the elderly retired teacher, had been quietly observing Colonel Pemberton since his arrival. She recognized the bearing of a man accustomed to command, but also noticed something else in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty that suggested even experienced military leaders could find themselves in uncharted territory. The crowd had grown to nearly 300 people, with tour guides now incorporating the unfolding drama into their palace commentary. Street vendors selling postcards and souvenirs had positioned themselves to get better views. Sensing that they might be witnessing something historically significant, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation, as if everyone collectively understood they were watching a moment that would be remembered and discussed for years too. Social media was exploding with commentary from around the world. Hashtag Royal Guard Choice was now trending globally, with people sharing their own opinions about what the Guard should do. Military veterans were divided in their responses, some insisting that protocol must be maintained at all costs, others arguing that true honor sometimes required breaking rules to serve a higher moral purpose. Sarah Mitchell found herself studying the young guard's face, trying to read the emotions behind his trained composure. She could see the tension in the set of his jaw, could notice the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested an internal struggle. Despite her family's situation, she felt a wave of sympathy for this young man who had been thrust into an impossible position through no fault of his own. Colonel Pemberton finally stepped forward, his polished boots clicking against the cobblestones. He positioned himself where he could speak to both his guard and the family without disrupting the formal positioning. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of decades of leadership but also a warmth that surprised many in the crowd. "Sir," he addressed James Mitchell directly, "I understand you've had an unfortunate accident with your belongings." His tone was respectful, acknowledging the family's distress without making assumptions about how the situation should be handled. James nodded, his voice shaky as he replied, "Yes, sir. Our vacation money, most of it scattered around your guard's position. We've recovered what we could from the areas we're allowed to access. But ... He gestured helplessly toward the bills still visible at Thomas's feet. Pemberton nodded thoughtfully. "I see, and you're visiting from America." "Ohio, sir. This is our first trip to London. We saved for 3 years for this vacation." James's voice cracked slightly as he spoke, the full weight of their loss becoming real again as he explained it to this authoritative figure. The colonel's expression softened almost imperceptibly. He turned to look at Private Hartford, who continued to stand in perfect position despite the extraordinary circumstances. Pemberton could see the discipline, the training, the absolute commitment to duty, but he could also sense the human struggle beneath the surface. "Private Hartford," Pemberton said, his voice carrying across the courtyard, "you are maintaining excellent discipline under very challenging circumstances." Thomas's only response was a slight straightening of his already perfect posture. Acknowledging his commanding officer's observation without breaking position, the crowd held its collective breath. Everyone sensed that this exchange between colonel and private was crucial, that the commanding officer's next words would determine how this unprecedented situation would be resolved. Pemberton walked slowly around the perimeter of the scattered money, careful not to step on any bills but clearly assessing the full scope of the situation. He could see that there were indeed several high-value notes directly at his guard's feet, completely inaccessible to the family under current security protocols. The colonel had served long enough to understand that some decisions transcend written regulations. He had learned in combat that rigid adherence to protocol, while usually correct, could sometimes lead to outcomes that served no one well. But he also knew that his decision here would be scrutinized by military leadership, by the media, and by the public for years to come. Security Officer Chen approached the colonel respectfully. "Sir, we've recovered all the money from publicly accessible areas. The remaining bills are within the restricted perimeter around the guard position." Pemberton nodded, his mind working through the implications of various courses of action. He could order the area cleared and have the money collected by security personnel later, but that would require the family to wait indefinitely and might create additional complications. He could maintain strict protocol and consider the money in the restricted area as lost, but that seemed unnecessarily harsh for what was clearly an accident. Margaret Thornberry had moved closer during these exchanges, and now she stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had taught school for 40 years and wasn't intimidated by authority. "Colonel," she said in her clear voice, "I've lived in London my entire life, and I've watched the changing of the guard ceremony since I was a child. These young men represent the very best of British tradition." Pemberton turned to face her, recognizing the respect due to an elderly citizen who clearly had something important to say. "But surely," Margaret continued, "the highest British tradition is helping those in need, especially visitors to our country who find themselves in distress through no fault of their own." Her words carried weight because they came not from emotion alone, but from a lifetime of watching these ceremonies, of understanding what the guards represented beyond their military function. There were symbols of Britain itself, and what did Britain want to represent to the world in this moment? The colonel looked back at Private Hartford, seeing not just a guard maintaining discipline, but a young man whose character was being tested in the most public way possible. He thought about his own son, about the values he hoped to instill, about what it truly meant to serve with honor. The decision was crystallizing in Pemberton's mind, but he also understood that whatever he chose would set a precedent that would influence how future situations might be handled. The weight of that responsibility was enormous, but so was the simple human need to help a family in distress. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the courtyard as hundreds of people waited to see what would happen when military tradition met human compassion in the most public forum imaginable. Colonel Pemberton took a deep breath, his decision finally crystallizing after what felt like an eternity of consideration. He had weighed the protocols, the precedents, and the human cost of his choice. Now, with hundreds of eyes upon him and cameras recording every moment, he was ready to act. "Private Hartford," he said, his voice carrying the authority of command but also something else, understanding, perhaps even approval. "You have maintained exceptional discipline under extraordinary circumstances. Your conduct has been exemplary." Thomas felt his heart rate increase slightly. The only physical reaction he allowed himself despite his training. He sensed that something significant was about to happen. That his commanding officer's next words would change everything, Pemberton continued, his voice now loud enough for the entire crowd to hear clearly. However, I am also aware that our duty as soldiers extends beyond mere adherence to protocol. Our ultimate service is to the Crown and to the people of Britain, and by extension to the guests who honor our country with their visit. The crowd was absolutely silent now, hanging on every word. Sarah Mitchell grabbed her husband's hand tightly, hardly daring to hope but sensing that something momentous was about to unfold. "Private Hartford," the colonel said, stepping closer to his guard, "I am giving you a direct order." The formality of the word sent a ripple through the crowd. Everyone understood that a direct order from a commanding officer was not to be questioned or disobeyed. You are to assist this family in recovering their belongings, while maintaining the dignity and honor of your position and your uniform. Pemberton's words were carefully chosen, acknowledging both the human need and the military standards that had to be preserved for the first time in over 3 hours. Private Thomas Hartford moved, but he did not simply break ranks and scramble for the money. Instead, he executed a perfect military pivot, turning to face the Mitchell family with the same precision and dignity he had shown while standing at attention. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, the sound echoing off the palace walls. People were crying, cheering, and capturing the moment on their phones as Thomas bent down with military precision to collect the scattered bills at his feet. But Thomas did something unexpected. Instead of simply gathering the money quickly, he treated each bill with the same care and attention he gave to his military duties. He picked up each note carefully, smoothed out any wrinkles, and arranged them in a neat stack. His movements were deliberate and respectful, showing that even this act of compassion would be performed with military precision. James Mitchell stood frozen in disbelief, tears streaming down his face as he watched this young soldier carefully collecting his family's vacation money. Sarah had her hands pressed to her mouth, overwhelmed by the kindness and the unexpected turn of events. Their children watched in fascination as the guard they had thought was just a statue revealed himself to be a real person with real compassion. Margaret Thornberry wiped tears from her eyes with her handkerchief, feeling proud of both the young guard and his commanding officer. This was the Britain she remembered from her youth, where doing the right thing mattered more than following rules blindly. As Thomas collected the final bill, he stood and executed another perfect military movement, turning to face James Mitchell directly. With the same formal precision he would use in any official ceremony, he extended the carefully arranged stack of money toward the grateful father. "Sir," Thomas said, his voice clear and professional despite the emotional weight of the moment, "I believe these belong to you." James reached out with trembling hands to accept the money, but found his voice caught in his throat. Finally, he managed to whisper, thank you so much." But Thomas wasn't finished. With the same attention to detail he had shown in collecting the bills, he began scanning the surrounding area for any money that might have been missed. He found 2 20-pound notes that had blown under a nearby barrier, and 1 10-pound note that had become caught in the ornate eye of the palace gate. The efficiency and thoroughness with which he, who formed this task, impressed even his commanding officer. This young man was demonstrating that compassion and military excellence were not mutually exclusive, that one could maintain dignity and precision even while performing an act of kindness. Security Officer Chen, who had been managing the crowd throughout the incident, found himself moved by the scene. In 12 years of palace security, he had seen many unusual situations, but never anything that combined protocol breaking with such obvious dignity and care. As Thomas completed his search and returned to his position, Colonel Pemberton addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you have witnessed today represents the finest traditions of the British military, not just discipline and protocol, but compassion, service, and the understanding that our ultimate duty is to serve others." The crowd's applause was thunderous. Tour guides were already incorporating this story into their presentations. Street vendors were discussing what they had witnessed, and the social media response was overwhelmingly positive. The hashtags had evolved from #RoyalGuardDilemma to #RoyalGuardHeart and #BritishCompassion. James had finished counting the recovered money and realized that Thomas had found nearly everything. Thanks to the guards' careful attention and the help of other tourists, they had lost only about £200 instead of the $1,500 he had feared. The vacation was saved. Sarah approached Thomas, who had resumed his formal position but was clearly still accessible for conversation. "Young man," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you properly. You've saved our vacation, but more than that, you've restored our faith in human kindness." Thomas, still maintaining his professional bearing, replied quietly, "Ma'am, it was my honor to assist you. I hope you and your family have a wonderful time in London." Little Emma tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered something. Sarah smiled through her tears and nodded. "My daughter wants to know if she can give you a hug to say thank you." For just a moment, Thomas's professional composure cracked slightly, revealing the young man beneath the uniform. He looked toward Colonel Pemberton, who gave an almost imperceptible nod of approval. "That would be very nice, Miss Thomas said, bending down to Emma's level. The photograph of the 8-year-old American girl hugging the Royal Guard would become one of the most shared images on social media that year, symbolizing the bridge between military duty and human compassion, between protocol and kindness. As the crowd began to disperse, many people approached the Mitchell family in private Hartford to express their appreciation for what they had witnessed. The story was already being picked up by international news outlets, with headlines like "Royal Guard breaks protocol to help American family and compassion trumps rules at Buckingham Palace." Colonel Pemberton watched the aftermath with satisfaction. He had made the right choice. He was certain of that now. Military discipline was important, but it served a higher purpose, the protection and service of others. Today, that service had been demonstrated in the most visible and meaningful way possible. The morning sun was now high in the sky, and the changing of the guard ceremony was approaching. But everyone present knew they had already witnessed something far more memorable than any routine ceremony. They had seen the moment when humanity triumphed over protocol, when doing the right thing mattered more than following rules, and when a young soldier proved that true strength lay not just in standing still, but in knowing when to move. 3 months after the incident at Buckingham Palace, the ripple effects of that extraordinary morning were still being felt around the world. The video of Private Thomas Hartford helping the Mitchell family had been viewed over 50 million times across various social media platforms, becoming one of the most watched feel-good stories of the year. James Mitchell sat in his office back in Ohio, looking at the framed photograph on his desk. The image of his daughter Emma hugging the Royal Guard. The local newspaper had featured their story on the front page with the headline, "Ohio Family's London Miracle," and James had been invited to speak at several community events about their experience. The vacation had indeed been saved, and it had exceeded all their expectations. The story of Thomas's kindness had opened doors they never could have imagined. Restaurant owners in London had heard about their situation and invited them for complimentary meals. Theatre managers had offered them tickets to West End shows. Even the hotel where they were staying had upgraded them to a suite when they learned they were the family from the Royal Guard video. But more importantly for James, the experience had restored his faith in human nature. He had seen kindness from strangers, compassion from authority figures, and dignity in the face of difficult choices. The memory of that young soldier's careful attention to collecting every single bill, treating their lost money with the same respect he would show to military equipment, still brought tears to his eyes. Sarah had started a blog called Kindness Across Cultures, where she shared stories of unexpected compassion from their travels and encouraged others to share similar experiences. The Royal Guard story was her first and most popular post, but she had since collected dozens of other stories from people around the world who had experienced unexpected kindness from strangers there. Children had been changed by the experience too. Emma had started a school project about heroes in uniforms and had written a letter to Thomas that her teacher helped her mail to Buckingham Palace. Michael had developed a deep interest in military history and was already talking about possibly pursuing a military career when he was older, inspired by the example of honor and compassion he had witnessed. Meanwhile, at Buckingham Palace, Private Thomas Hartford had become something of a legend among his fellow guards. The story of his compassionate action had spread throughout the military, and he had received commendations from officers all the way up to the highest levels of command. But more importantly to Thomas, he had received hundreds of letters from people around the world who had been inspired by his actions. Colonel Pemberton had been proven right in his decision. Rather than undermining military discipline, the incident had actually enhanced the reputation of the Queen's Guard. Recruitment applications had increased by 30% in the months following the incident, with many applicants specifically citing the example of compassionate service they had seen in the viral video. The palace's public relations department, initially worried about the precedent being set, had been overwhelmed by the positive response. Tour bookings had increased, merchandise sales featuring the Royal Guards had spiked, and international media coverage of the palace had been overwhelmingly positive. The incident had humanized the guards without diminishing their dignity or authority. Thomas himself had been promoted to Lance Corporal ahead of schedule, with his superiors noting his exceptional judgment under pressure and his ability to maintain military bearing even while performing an act of compassion. He had been invited to speak at military academies about the balance between protocol and humanity, though he remained characteristically modest about his role in the incident. The story had also sparked discussions in military institutions around the world about the nature of service and duty. Military ethicists had written papers analyzing the decision, most concluding that Thomas and Colonel Pemberton had demonstrated the highest ideals of military service by understanding that rules serve people, not the other way around. Margaret Thornberry, the elderly retired teacher who had spoken up during the incident, had been invited to several television interviews where she eloquently discussed the importance of standing up for what's right, regardless of age or authority. She had become something of a local celebrity and was often asked to speak at schools about citizenship and civic responsibility. The incident had also led to a formal review of palace security protocols. While the basic procedures remained unchanged, There were now clearer guidelines for how guards could assist visitors in emergency situations without compromising their primary duties. The review concluded that compassionate action, when performed with proper military bearing and approval from superiors, actually enhanced rather than diminished the guards' effectiveness. International media had picked up the story as an example of British values at their best. The incident had been featured in documentaries about modern monarchy, military service, and human kindness. Academic papers had been written about it in fields ranging from military ethics to tourism studies to social media analysis. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was on the thousands of people who had witnessed the incident in person or online and had been inspired to act with greater compassion in their own lives. Social media was filled with stories of people performing small acts of kindness and crediting the Royal Guard video as their inspiration. A year later, the Mitchell family returned to London for a second vacation. This time, with money safely secured and a proper money belt, they made sure to visit Buckingham Palace again, hoping to catch a glimpse of Thomas, though they understood he might not be on duty at the same post. To their surprise and delight, Thomas was there, standing in the same position where they had first encountered him. This time, Emma was prepared. She had brought a drawing she had made of him helping her father, and with the permission of the security officers, she was allowed to present it to him. Thomas accepted the drawing with the same dignity and care he'd shown in collecting their scattered money a year before. He told them he had kept all the letters they had sent and that their story had inspired him to always remember the human side of his military service. The reunion was brief but meaningful, and it was captured by tourists who recognized the family from the original viral video. Within hours, Royal Guard reunion was trending on social media, with people expressing joy at seeing the continuation of a story that had touched so many lives. The family walked away from the palace for the second time. They reflected on how a moment of crisis had become a blessing not just for them, but for countless others who had been inspired by the story. They had learned that sometimes the most profound acts of kindness come not from breaking rules, but from understanding that the highest rule of all is to help others when they need it most. Private Thomas Hartford continued to stand at his post, knowing that he had become part of a story much larger than himself. He had learned that true military strength wasn't just about following orders, but about having the wisdom and courage to do what's right, even when the whole world is watching. The scattered money had been collected, the family's vacation had been saved, and the Royal Guard's reputation had been enhanced. But most importantly, a simple act of compassion had reminded the world that humanity's greatest strength lies not in rigid adherence to rules, but in knowing when those rules should serve the greater good of helping others in their time of need. The story of the tourist who dropped money in front of a royal guard had become a legend of compassion, proving that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply to care enough to help when help is needed most.